So when you're going to roll a slab, we need to start with a piece of clay that's going to be big enough to make the slab you need. And you sort of learn that, to eyeball that. You learn by making it too big or too small. So I'm going to start by flattening this out a bit. So as I'm doing this, I want to think about the shape of the slab I need to get out of it. So I'm going to try to pound this into a shape that will help me get what I need in the end. Once it's getting flatter, I can throw this, and I can throw it at an angle onto the table, and it helps stretch the clay. So I'm starting to make this into a longer piece rather than like a square, because the slab roller is going to flatten this out for me in one direction. So I need to get it flat in the other direction. And I want to flip it as I'm doing that. And I don't want to go too thin with this. I don't want to make it so that I get really thin spots that are thinner than the slab that I need. I also don't want to get too thin because clay has a memory. When you bend it, the clay particles will remember that bend and could warp on you. And if I let it get too thin and pick it up, if I want a flat slab, it'll warp on me as it dries. So right now I've got a piece that is still relatively thick, but is thin enough now to go through the slab roller. And my leading edge is fairly straight and a little bit thinner, so it eases it through. And you'll see as when we go to the slab roller what I'm talking about. So let's go over to the slab roller. We are at the slab roller, which currently lives in the hallway. And we're going to use this to roll out a slab of clay, which you saw me prepare in the studio. Now, you don't want to prepare your clay way ahead of time so it doesn't sit out and get hard or a skin, but it will be pretty fast to do this. So the first thing to note of this slab roller is that there's two sides. The roller is in the middle, and you have two screws that set the height, and you can kind of see the height marker here. And we want to make sure those are always set at the thickness we're trying to roll. Don't assume that it's going to be at the same thickness that you was when you left it. So always check that they are both set to the same thing and to the thing that you want it to be. So I'm going to set mine to 1/4 inch thick. They're both set to that, and now I'm ready to use the slab roller. To do that, I have my canvas, and you each have your own canvas that's cut for the slab roller. I'm going to open this up, and basically it's double the size of one of these sides. So I know that it will always fit. So I've got my canvas down, because we don't want to use the slab roller without canvas down. And I'm going to take the clay that I prepared, and I'm going to put it down in this orientation. The long piece is going on the short side of the slab roller. And I'm doing that because the slab roller is going to push my clay this way, but not much this way. So the longest part is not going to get much longer, but then it'll get pushed this way. When I put it down on the canvas, I want to give some extra space. I don't want to put it right up against the rollers because it's going to move a little bit that way too. So give it a few inches in between there, because when I'm going to fold it over and cover the top of the clay with canvas too. And so I've got some extra canvas, a couple inches of extra canvas before my clay starts. So I'm going to come around to my wheel, which is here, and I'm going to start feeding this through. It also helps to have some extra clay so you can grab it on the other side. So I'm going to start feeding it through, and you can see that the canvas is coming out there, and I just want to give it a little tug and lift up just a little bit so that it doesn't get sucked into the gap between the rollers and the bed. So I'm going to give it just a little lift, and when I know that my clay edge has passed the edge of the bed, I can stop lifting and just roll the clay through. So it's loose now, it's not moving, so it rolled off the end of the clay. Don't ever roll past the edge of the canvas. If your clay is too big and it gets pushed out, stop before you get to the end of the canvas, cut that lump of clay off, and use it for something else. Do not roll clay on this roller without canvas there. I always go back after this to give it a little bit more compression. And then it's back where I started. I'm going to take the canvas off the top of the clay, a little bit closer view of the clay here. And you might not be able to see it on the camera, but now this clay slab is very consistent, but it's got a texture of canvas on it, which I don't want to be there. It also has only been compressed really in this one direction. So I'm going to take a rib, this is my wooden rib, and I'm going to use this to both get rid of that canvas texture and to compress it in other directions. So I'm going to hold this rib at an angle, maybe 45, maybe even more than that, like a 30-60 angle, and I'm going to start running it across the slab in different directions to both smooth out that surface and to compress those clay particles. Clay particles are flat, they're like platelets, and they stack on top of one another, and when they're not compressed, they don't stack very well, and they're all over the place, and that leads to warping and cracking. And the more you compress them, the more they lay down on top of one another and stay where you put them. So I'm going to rib this a few times in different directions. When I feel like I've done it enough, I'd probably, if I was going to use this slab, probably do it a little bit more. When I feel like I've done it enough, I need to move this. So there are a couple ways you can do it. If you need your slab to be really flat and stay flat, we don't want to bend this clay, because if you remember earlier in the video I mentioned that clay has a memory. So if I pick this up and bend it and then put it back down, it will almost indefinitely warp in the firing. So instead of doing that, if I need to keep it flat, I'm going to take a drywall board, which you saw in the tour video where those are, and I'm going to place that on top of my slab, making sure it covers the whole thing. And I'm going to wrap this canvas edge around nice and tight, and I'm going to quickly flip this over and then take the canvas off. And now my slab is on a board without being bent, which means it's a lot less likely that it's going to warp. I'm going to take this opportunity to rivet on the other side too, because it needs the compression and it needs to get rid of that canvas texture. Drywall boards are really nice for slabs because if clay starts to set up on one side but not the other, it'll warp because clay shrinks as it sets up. So if this was on a board, a plastic board for instance, not only would it stick down really hard, but the top would dry much faster than the bottom and it would warp. So on a drywall board, drywall pulls moisture out of the clay. So it's drying both on the bottom and the top at the same time. You do have to be careful with it. You can't leave this sit overnight or anything. Even with plastic over the top, it'll get too dry because it's pulling it out of the bottom too. So you really have to, much like many things in clay, you have to think about your timing. So now I've got a slab that is compressed on both sides. There's no more canvas texture and it's ready for me to use for projects. Make sure that you put your canvas away or let it dry before you fold it up. If you've rolled a lot of slabs, this is going to be really wet and you want this to dry out before you fold it up.